Hi, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Ken Evans, a photographer based in the mid-Atlantic. I needed to drive to Maine on family business, and I managed to carve out a little time for my camera and myself. Come along then, and see what I saw and photographed. Autumn in Maine is all about color. Red maples, golden birches, and every shade in between. But is it possible to see a deeper, different story in black and white? On a recent trip north, I set myself that challenge, to see if light, texture, and atmosphere could tell autumn's story without relying solely on its colors. I found myself slowing down, waiting longer at each spot, noticing the small details, skeletons of trees rising out of swamps, the way puddles mirrored the gray sky, and the hush that comes when fog fills the landscape. At first I resisted the gloom. I was tempted to shoot blue skies, golden hours, and the postcard views, but eventually I decided to work with what nature gave me. The dampness, the muted light, and the shifting atmosphere, they became part of my short story. Details appeared everywhere. A Northwood sign doesn't mince words any more than the people who live there. Black and white let me focus on lines and surfaces rather than the obvious and pointed message formed by paint and lettering. From across a lake, Maine's tallest mountain, Katahdin, rose through a veil of low clouds. A cold easterly wind from the Atlantic swept across the water, erasing its base until the peak seemed to float. In black and white, it felt almost mythic, less like a mountain and more like the power of nature surfacing through a magic mist. This is where shape and atmosphere became the story, creating strong emotional ties to the landscape I grew up near. As you can see, the weather in Maine was a mixed bag. Foggy mornings where barns and fields seemed to dissolve into gray air. Misty rain soaked the back roads and turned the leaves slick and shiny. And then every now and then, a clear autumn day with sharp blue skies and crisp light like you only find in Maine. On sunny days, even the smallest subjects caught my attention. A single water plant poking above the surface, its stem encircled by bubbles, a fragile marker of life in the stillness. In black and white, it became less about the plant itself and more about the quiet geometry of stem, circle, and reflection. Black and white simplifies, but it can also complicate. It asks you to see differently, to find rhythm and repetition, balance and disorder. These reflections of trees became less about forest and water, and more about lines, patterns, and the weight of light itself. And then, sometimes, the subject dissolves almost entirely into abstraction, reeds crossing in front of one another like brushstrokes, creating a sketch of nature that's no longer descriptive, but expressive. Nature has a rhythm all its own. Watching the surface of the lake, the ripples reminded me to breathe deeply, enjoy the moment. That black and white photography doesn't have to be a struggle. I didn't see a lot of wildlife this trip, but a lone turkey wandered into my frame, reminding me that sometimes photographs aren't planned, they're gifts. In black and white, it became less about feathers and fields and more about surprise created by shape and contrast. Coastal Maine always presents different photography opportunities. A weathered ship's window surrounded by peeling paint might have been boring if the frame included the entire boat. Framed in a close-up composition and in black and white, it felt rugged, even solemn, as if the story of time itself had settled into the view. The bow of a small boat, tied and still, its line touching the surface of the water. The registration letters M.E. just visible, a quiet marker of a special place. Reflections of clouds and light ripple across the surface, turning a simple scene into something that I hope asks you to look twice. And then there are images that walk the line between the documentary and the symbolic. An American flag tacked to a fence, a roadside sign promising clams and fresh seafood. Together they capture something about Maine that's equal parts tradition, irony, and resilience. A lone tree stood against the fog, holding its ground on the ridge, Stripped of color, it became more than a tree. It became a marker of solitude, a reminder of how black and white can turn landscape into meaning. Architecture in black and white often carries a weight that color softens. This old doorway, worn by years of weather, felt like a threshold, not just to a building, but to the local history of changing seasons, endurance, and hard work. The play of shadows across another door fascinated me. Branches traced themselves like ink lines, a drawing imposed by the light of that moment. Photography gave it permanence, the fleeting made lasting, and the image reminded me that the season of long shadows and shorter days had begun in earnest. A churchyard, a gathering of ancient gravestones, and one immense tree casting its reach across them all. In color, this would have been picturesque. In black and white, it became something else, contemplative, timeless, maybe even a little spooky. And then there was this little barn, more a shed really, muted by the sunrise fog, the kind of scene that evokes silence and contemplation. Black and white let the little barn and the mist-filled air become one, dissolving into the atmosphere. You might think me crazy, but there's a certain romance to this image I like. This lone pine made me think of Maine's recent flag referendum, a push to return to a minimalist pine and star flag. Ultimately, voters decided to keep the current design, but the idea stayed with me. The image of a single pine has always carried quiet strength, a kind of stoic endurance that feels right for Maine. And then back to the quiet. Fog thick enough to erase the horizon, trees becoming little more than tone and outline. In moments like this, black and white doesn't need to explain anything. It just lets you feel the stillness. At night, along the coast, the fog closes in and the world feels smaller. Sounds drift across the water, but their source and direction are hard to place. You can hear your own breathing, slow and deliberate, as you press the camera shutter. The bridge lights became my only horizon, their glow reflected in the water like quiet markers of presence. It wasn't just a study of light. It was a study of atmosphere and of how sound, distance, and stillness merge into one unforgettable moment. A locomotive cutting across a yard of stacked logs, smoke rising into the air. Scenes like this can have a kind of weight, industrial, rough, but also timeless in black and white. Northern Maine is still a timber-based economy, and its people work hard to keep this traditional way of work and life going. Without the warm browns of freshly cut spruce wood, these logs became a study in texture and repetition. Pattern overtook material as the subject of the shot. The everyday turned into abstraction and geometry. An image is one thing, but the reality of the toughness and time to work in this industry is also apparent in the volume of cut ends. And then lastly, there was this tree, lit against the dark, its branches seemingly branching into an infinite network reminded me of an anatomical illustration. Black and white didn't just record it, it transformed it into a drawing made by light itself. But here's my question. Is black and white still valid in autumn, a season that seems to demand photographing in color? For me, it is. In fact, I'd argue it sharpens the challenge and deepens the reward. But I'd love to hear what you think. Looking back now, I realize these photographs are less about the season and more about the decision to see differently. They remind me that art comes not from what's expected, but from what we dare to try. That's it for this week's video. If you like my videos, please subscribe, give it a like, and most important of all, share your reactions and thoughts. They mean the world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. Remember, black and white art is art for anywhere.